following is a Comfortably Zoned Radio Network production.
Yo, Philadelphia, how yous doing? Welcome to Philadelphia Baseball, past, present, and personal. I'm Bill Kashatus, your host on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network. Major League Baseball canceled spring training last week and pushed back the start of the regular season due to the national emergency created by the COVID-19 pandemic. Players were told to leave their spring training sites in Florida and Arizona. However, they have the option of remaining in their spring cities, returning to their club's home city, or returning to their off-season homes. MLB's actions follows the decisions of the NBA and the NHL to suspend their seasons. In addition, every major collegiate conference canceled its postseason men's and women's basketball tournaments, and the billion-dollar NCAA tournament has been canceled. For most of us, the coronavirus is unprecedented. But more than a century ago, another pandemic put a hold on everyday activities as well. It was called the Spanish flu, and it was the deadliest influenza pandemic in human history. An estimated 500 million people were infected worldwide. That was one-third of the world's population at the time. At least 50 million of those infected died of the disease. The number of deaths in the United States reached approximately 675,000. As you'd expect, the ramifications of Spanish flu touched all parts of society, including Major League Baseball. On this podcast, we will explore the Spanish flu of 1918, its impact on baseball, and compare it to the current pandemic. My guest is Randy Roberts, author of the forthcoming book, War Fever, Boston, Baseball, and America in the Shadow of the Great War, which explores the impact of World War I and the Spanish influenza on the 1918 professional baseball season. Roberts is Distinguished Professor of History at Purdue University. He is the author and co-author of more than 36 books, many about athletes, celebrities, and historical figures. As an authority of pop culture, sports, and the military, Roberts has also consulted for several networks, including the History Channel, BBC, HBO, PBS, ABC, CBS, and NBC. Welcome to the podcast, Randy. It's a pleasure to have you.
Hey, Bill. It's good to be here. I'll tell you, I heard you say yous. I grew up in Pittsburgh, and I always said yuns. And that must be a local variation, so it's good to hear a Pennsylvania accent.
You're right. It is. It's yous and yuns here in Pennsylvania. Well,
yeah, so, some say yuns, but I always grew up yuns in the part of Pennsylvania I was from.
But I guess out there in Western PA, you do the Warsh like they do in Indiana too, right?
We did do Warsh, but I worked all my life out. Once I moved away from Pittsburgh, stopped saying Washington and Warsh, and yeah, absolutely. I say that second. Rubber bands and call them gum bands, and yeah. Well, it's a different language out in the Appalachians.
Oh, very definitely. You consider yourself a Hoosier now?
I've lived longer in Indiana than any other place I've lived. Yeah, I've been here since 1988 teaching at Purdue. Do I consider myself a Hoosier? No, I consider myself a Pennsylvanian. And my wife always gets on me. People say, well, where are you from? And I don't say, I said, well, I'm from Pennsylvania. It's where were you born? But I don't know.
Yeah, I've always, of course, I went to college in Richmond, Indiana, and my love for Earlham is very strong. So I've always considered myself an honorary Hoosier because I go back there an awful lot. Still, have a lot to do with the college.
Well,
Randy,
I would always spend my summers down in Stone Harbor and go down to the Jersey Shore, southern Jersey Shore. Anyway,
oh yeah, then you're very definitely a Pennsylvanian. Yeah. Well, listen, I know a lot of listeners are really curious about this topic, and I guess we begin with just how and where did the Spanish flu of 1918 originate?
Well, that's a good question, and that's one that still plagues people today. I think there's a convincing argument to say that it was started out in Haskell County, Kansas. And it was an avian-type flu that jumped from birds to human beings to pigs to human beings. Anyway, it started out there, and then it went to a training camp. This is World War I. We're talking now about 1917. And it goes to a training camp, Fort Haskell. Excuse me, not Fort Haskell. I'm forgetting the name of the fort all of a sudden. Anyway, it jumps to the fort out there, and why I can't think of it is beyond. Funston, Fort Funston. And then from there, it traveled all over the country, but mostly east with Army troops that were getting ready to go overseas, and they went to Boston. So we saw it in Boston, but we also saw it down in Arkansas in Fort Pike. Then we're talking now about January, early in 1918. It breaks out, and it's a bad flu, and it kills some people, but it's not ultimately a really deadly flu. It goes to Boston, then it goes overseas, and then in the late summer, in August, early September, it comes back to Boston, and that's the flu, the Spanish influenza, that's really bad. Anyway, that's one argument, that it comes out of Kansas. Other scholars, scientists think that maybe it came out of Central Asia or even Vietnam, because those were parts of the world that were not as badly affected. And so maybe the people, the theory goes, had developed some immunities. Other people said it was a completely new flu that started someplace in France or on the Western Front in British or French military camps. So there's a bunch of different arguments. But if, looking at all of them, I would go with Haskell County and Fort Funston.
Well, now, this is interesting because you've named a bunch of places. Here in the U.S., Kansas, Boston, you've named Vietnam, China, you've named France. Why call it the Spanish flu? Is that xenophobic on our part, or why call it the Spanish flu?
Not really. Remember, Spain wasn't in World War I, so there was no real censorship of press in Spain in World War I. There was a censorship in the United States to a great degree, but particularly in Great Britain and France and the other warring nations. And so it could have been in those nations, and it was in those nations, but they didn't write about it in the press. But the King of Spain got the flu and recovered, and that was well covered in newspapers around the world, and particularly in the Western world, in the United States and Great Britain and the West. And so, it was identified with the king, and so they started calling it Spanish influenza. It most certainly did not start in Spain. That's the one place I could pretty much guarantee you it did not start. It was already all over the place. The first 3 big outbreaks of it take place in ports. One of them is Brest. It's a deep water port in the northwestern part of France. And this is where 40% of American soldiers going to the Western Front entered France through Brest. Okay, and people are coming and going to Brest. Ships from Africa are going to Brest, from Asia. So it breaks out about the same time in July in Brest. The second place was in Freeport, Sierra Leone, in which it very well could have broken out. I mean, it breaks out there, and this is, again, a port that's connecting Asia and Africa and Europe and America. And then the third place was Boston. All about the same time it breaks out in those 3 places, and then from there spreads inland.
Mm-hmm. Now, according to Rupert Blue, who was the U.S. Surgeon General in September of 1918, the Spanish flu is, quote, characterized by a sudden onset. And this is a quote from him. People are stricken on the streets or while at work. First there is a chill, then fever with temperatures from 101 to 103, headache, backache, reddening and running of the eyes, pains and aches all over the body, and general prostration. And then Blue advised those who felt these symptoms to, quote, go to their homes at once, get in bed without delay, and immediately call a physician. What about treatment? I mean, why was medical science so ill-equipped to handle this pandemic?
Well, there was really no treatment. You got sick, and it oftentimes rapidly progressed to death, and maybe we can talk about the deaths later, but they were just horrible, just unimaginably horrible. The only good part about it is it was relatively quick, and just in a matter of days. Or you got better, but there was no vaccine for the flu. I mean, it was a completely unknown variety of flu. Just as today, with what we have today, there's no vaccine for it. We're not vaccinating for what we have today because it's a new variety of flu. That's one thing about influenza. It changes. We get most influenzas that we get we can vaccinate against again, but our bodies, we've seen those before. Our bodies have kind of become immune to them to a certain degree. So they have the ability to make us sick, although flu still does kill a lot of people every year. But this was a completely new one, and it was a very virulent brand of flu. It's just when the one that left the United States, it morphed into something much more deadly when it comes back to the United States. It was just horrible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Now, I do want to, for listeners, many of whom are Philadelphians, obviously, I do want to talk a little bit about the death rates, and maybe you could, shed some more light about how widespread this Philadelphia resembled, the rest of the country. Here in Philadelphia, by September of 1918, the disease had spread to the civilian population, moved across the city devastatingly fast. Morgues were overwhelmed. The supply of caskets quickly depleted. Public activities were canceled. Spitting on the street was made a crime. So many youngsters died that average life expectancy was reduced by 10 years. And in less than 5 weeks, from September until early November 1918, more than 12,000 Philadelphians died. That's more than 25% of those who contracted the flu in the city who died. And by the time the flu subsided, there were 47,000 reported cases in Philadelphia, and that is more than 30% of the city's 1.6 million residents contracted the flu. Now, how did that compare with other major American cities?
Philadelphia was one of the worst. After Boston, Philadelphia gets hit. And Philadelphia, the authorities in Philadelphia were very slow to react, tried to cover up what was going on. They made all sorts of mistakes. Some cities are doing what cities are doing in America today. Some cities are saying, okay, let's quarantine, let's hunker down, let's not get around in groups. But Philadelphia were very slow to react to it. And for those reasons and a variety of others, Philadelphia was particularly hard hit. I mean, if you compare Philadelphia to St. Louis, which gets it much later, the St. Louis figures are much less. I think overall the mortality rate was only really about 2% of the people that got it. So when you say 25%, I mean, those are just enormously high mortality rates.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And Boston, I mean, that's really kind of the focus of your book, correct?
Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure the exact number, but thousands die in Boston. Now, the book that Johnny Smith and I wrote, the flu is part of the book, and certainly it's in the background. But the book deals with much more than the flu. The book deals with kind of America in 1918 and World War I, and we look at America through 3 individuals. It just so happens that one of the individuals that we look at is Babe Ruth, and so we're following Babe Ruth becoming a hitter for the first time. And where he really makes a transition from being a pitcher to a hitter. But so we're following him through the season, and the flu is almost following him through the season too. So we see when they go down to Arkansas for spring training, they're very close to Fort Pike, where the flu breaks out in both the spring and the fall. And in the spring, a number of players, Boston players, a few Boston players caught what that time they called the grip. The flu was often called the grip. And, the sports writers were talking about how many people were getting sick, and they were talking about, this is a perfect epidemic of flu. Now, they weren't dying at that time. And then in the summer, it's still around, and Babe Ruth caught the flu. He got it again in the fall then. He doesn't die, but Harry Frazee, the owner, also gets it. And so as we follow that story through the book, it just so happens that when the World Series comes around, it was a shortened season, and so they played the World Series in early September. And during the World Series, it really breaks out in Boston. And, Boston did the wrong things, too. I mean, they were holding draft rallies, they were holding baseball games, they were holding military parades, and so they had all these activities that grouped people together, and so it was like Boston turned into like a petri dish.
Who are the other two individuals, Randy, that you cover or that you follow in the book?
We followed three celebrities of sorts, three that became very different types of celebrities. The other person we follow is a German who was a famous conductor, a world-famous conductor of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, a guy by the name of Karl Muck. And Muck, was accused of not playing the national anthem since he was German. It wasn't, but then he was investigated and found out that he had other problems in his life. He was accused of being a spy. He wasn't a spy, and he was sent to an internment camp. It looks at really repression in World War I. And then the other person we cover is first Medal of Honor winner, Congressional Medal of Honor winner, a guy by the name, first one awarded, a guy by the name of Whittlesey. And Whittlesey, was an amazing person. And he was the leader of the Lost Battalion.
Wow, you really do cover the gambit there. I mean, and the context for it is great. I mean, you must be dealing with the Creel Committee and the Espionage Act and baseball and military. I mean, that is,
all those things. Yeah, Charles Whittlesey, was all of them are connected with Boston. Okay, Babe Ruth plays in Boston. Muck, who's German. None of them are from Boston, but they're all connected with Boston. Muck, Boston Symphony Orchestra. Charles Whittlesey, Harvard Law student, who was very patriotic, and goes into the war shortly after it's over. Smart guy, very mild-mannered person, really nice person, and finds himself commanding in, probably the most harrowing battle, most harrowing experience in World War I, the Lost Battalion, where he goes in with, over 700 men, and less than 200 are able to walk out of this pocket. They had been surrounded by the Germans.
Wow. You mentioned baseball, and I was not aware that the first wave did have an impact on baseball. I just thought it was the second wave, and other people have written about this time period tend to say that Major League Baseball got lucky. Because of World War I, the season had ended a month early, as you pointed out, on September the 2nd, before the worst of the outbreak. But the first outbreak did then impact at least some of the players. Is that correct?
Some of them. They didn't really. There were very few that died at that time, but they were sick. But it was more typical flu. You're sick anybody who's got flu knows, you get the same symptoms. You have the runny nose, you have the fever, you have the aches, and you lay in bed for a couple of days, and you just ache and you feel terrible. But then it goes away. And this one was a little worse than others. But for most healthy people, it wasn't that, they recovered. And, they were back in a week. They were back in playing. Babe Ruth now in the summer, he got it, and he came to the ballpark. He was supposed to pitch. This is in July. And he was just miserable. He had a fever. His throat hurt. I mean, all the classic symptoms of the flu. And the manager said, no, you're not pitching today. I mean, you're terrible. And they send him home. And he goes to a doctor. And a doctor does what they did if a person had a really bad throat. They used a kind of a silver nitrate. But it was very hard to use this. You couldn't let it drip down into their lungs. It could be fatal. And this dripped down in Babe's lungs, and he became very seriously ill and was taken to the hospital. And there were rumors that he was dying in the Boston newspapers. And so, he survived not so much the flu, but the doctor's treatment of it at that time. Wow. Yeah, it was interesting story for the Babe. But again, that first one, it disappeared. Eventually it was gone. People kind of forgot about it, and then, boy, it came back with a vengeance.
There must have been some at least realization that this could get worse, though, because I was trolling the net the other day, and I came across an online piece that Bill Francis, director of research at the National Baseball Hall of Fame, wrote about 1918 and the influence of the epidemic on baseball. And he writes, baseball would temporarily ban the spitball as a health precaution, and in at least one minor league game, players wore masks, prodded by a little ditty that urged them to, quote, obey the laws and wear the gauze, protect your jaws from septic paws. I don't know.
I did not run across that. I should have done some more minor league research, I guess. But I have seen pictures of a game with people in masks, and up at the bat, trying to get at the plate or getting ready to swing with a gauze on their mouth. Yeah, it was the treatment for it. Nobody really knew what to do. Now, oddly enough, some people said you should chew tobacco. Chewing tobacco for some people was okay. You should chew tobacco. Other people said, what you needed to do is you needed to pull your teeth, and so people were having their teeth pulled out. I can kind of conjure a vision of somebody chewing tobacco with no teeth and, trying to ward off the problems. But there were all kinds of different wives' tales and folk tales about how to get rid of the flu. And so they didn't really know. I mean, the state of medical science wasn't that great. It wasn't like the germ theory had caught on at every place in America. So people were mystified. The medical establishment was quickly overwhelmed. I mean, what we fear today, of course, is we only have so many respirators, we only have so many masks, we have only so many hospital beds, and they may be overwhelmed. This is exactly what happened in 1918. There was no place to treat all the people. They were using triage. Some people were dying, and you quickly had to make a decision: is this person likely to make it or not? When they started turning, deep purple from the lack of oxygen coming from the lungs to the face, that was a sure sign that the end was really very much in sight. People were bleeding from their eyes, their ears, their nose. I mean, it was just, it was awful. There were those fears of Ebola, and I'm sure still fears of Ebola, that what Ebola did to people and how fast Ebola would kill people. I remember when a book called The Hot Zone came out and talked about it. That was the same sort of thing that they were experiencing with the flu in 1918. And then there was a third wave that was still pretty strong, not as bad as the second, that took place in 1919. And we think that actually that Woodrow Wilson probably caught the flu. We thought he had a stroke when he was at Treaty of Versailles, but he probably caught that third wave 1919 flu when he was in Paris at the Treaty of Versailles.
Speaking of Wilson, what measures did he take to prevent the spread of the virus here in the United States? I mean, the CDC wasn't around until 1946. The World Health Organization, that was founded 2 years later, so we didn't have any organizations monitoring this kind of thing. So what did Wilson do?
It was mostly a local problem.
Really?
Didn't do much of anything, no.
Wow.
I mean, he was concentrating on the war effort and particularly, the peace effort. On January 8th, 1918, he had initiated his, he had announced his 14 points, a peace plan for Europe that was eventually semi-adopted. The Germans wanted it when they were getting ready to surrender in November. Don't get it, but that's another story. But he's kind of concentrating on the war effort and suppression of dissent at home. We had the Sedition Act that if you were guilty of criticizing Wilson or the government or America's war effort, you could be sentenced to 20 years in prison. And of course, some radicals like Eugene Debs and Bill Haywood fell foul of those regulations.
Mm-hmm. Now, you say it's a local problem. My suspicion then is that the cities would have suffered the most because of the population density. I mean, that's my knee-jerk reaction, but I'm sitting up here in northeastern Pennsylvania right now, the Anthracite district, where my family is originally from, and I know that it gripped this area, the Wilkes-Barre area, very badly because there were a lot of orphans here. There were a number of orphanages that were started by the Catholic churches up here because the parents of these kids died. So it wasn't just a question of population density. This hit the whole country, correct?
Yeah. As you said, 675,000 Americans die of this. I mean, it's an enormous figure, not compared to some other parts of the world, but still, I mean, an unbelievable epidemic. It's the Black Plague coming. Yeah, I had relatives that lived in Scranton, which isn't that, or actually they were from Moscow, which is outside Scranton.
That's right.
In that region you had it too. It was in Willa-Cather and out in the country. Yeah, so it hit the countryside as well as cities.
And again, this is left to local authorities, and they took the same precautions. I mean, high school football seasons were canceled. Movie theaters closed. Of course, in Philadelphia, the fans of the Phillies and the A's didn't have to worry so much because the Phils finished in 6th place and the A's in 8th place in 1918, so they weren't going to contract anything at Baker Bowl or Shibe Park. But tell us about the World Series between the Boston Red Sox and the Chicago Cubs. I mean, as you said, Boston was gripped pretty hard by this. What precautions were taken during the World Series?
Yeah, I might say before I answer that question, Jack Dempsey was going to fight battling Levinsky in Philadelphia during the reign of when Philadelphia had it, and so that fight had to be canceled. Mm-hmm. And of course, this is right before Jack Dempsey in July of 1919. July 4th, 1919 is when he'll win the world title. So he's not champion yet, but he's a major contender by that time. The series in 1918 was an amazing series. It got started in Chicago, and just a couple days before it started, the Big Bill Haywood's trial was going on, and radicals, probably Wobblies, International Workers' World, exploded a bomb outside of the federal courthouse that did enormous damage. And a guy working in the post office at the time that was modestly shaken up by it was a guy by the name of Walt Disney, who became famous. And so, this we're talking about a series that starts, and people are fearing the beginning of another Russian Revolution. This is radicals with bombs, and so that gave a kind of an air of unreality to the series itself. Then it starts off with Babe Ruth pitching a magnificent game, a 1-0 victory, pitching a shutout, and then and on that day that it starts, Boston is being alerted that there's a problem. Okay, the leading health authority in Boston is saying, look, we've got a real epidemic on our hands, and he's appealing for kind of federal help that's not going to come, or he's contacting other people. So by the time that the game shifts after a couple games in Chicago, and it shifts to Boston, there's a real fear that we have an epidemic on our hands. And the series almost doesn't progress much further because they changed the rules. The attendance was terrible. So they changed it, and the rules had been changed that not just the winners and losers are going to get paid, but the second place teams in the league also. And they decided to reduce the payment. And so the players are saying, geez, you know what? We expected to get this much money if we win, this much money if we lose. We're not going to get anywhere close to it. So we're going on strike. So there was a threat for one of the games that the players didn't come out on the field. They didn't come out for warm-up. And there was an intervention, and the commissioner was in there pleading with them. And finally somebody says, look, we've got wounded veterans in the stands. You can't go on strike. We've got fear of radicalism. Baseball players don't strike. And so the game gets started late, and they're booed when they come out. This is the Boston team, but Chicago agreed with them, and so they played the games anyway. So it's the air of just it was like the whole baseball season. Are we going to be able to play a season? Nobody knew at the beginning. Once it starts, are we going to play all the way through the season? Well, it turns out no, it was a shortened season. Are we going to be able to play the World Series? We don't know. It's not until late in the game that the draft board, guy by the name of Crowder, who was the head of the Select Service group, says, okay, the two teams can play a World Series. And then there's a work and fight orders that the players have to either work in a defense plan or an exempt industry, or they have to join the military. So it was a crazy season. And in the midst, Babe Ruth is introducing the long ball to Americans, and so it's crazy.
And we got to remember here that Naismith didn't invent basketball until, I guess, later. Football, professional football, was nothing. It was college football, I guess, at this period of time. So baseball was the national pastime. I mean, I know that Connie Mack had a football team just to keep his players in shape for the baseball season.
Go ahead, finish. I'm sorry.
Yeah. So when you talk about canceling a World Series or even a stoppage, you're talking about an extraordinary action here.
Yeah, baseball was the national game. There were really two major professional sports at that time. There was baseball and there was boxing. And you might expect this from boxers. Boxing was kind of considered a seedy sport and filled with all kinds of corruption. Baseball was considered pure. Of course, it wasn't. Gambling on baseball was enormous. I mean, there was rumors that the 1918 World Series or 1917 World Series was fixed. Of course, the 1919 series, as everyone knows, was the Black Sox scandal, was a fixed series. But still, in the public imagination, baseball players were kids. They were paragons of virtues. They represented the best of America, of competition, of playing a kid's game that they loved. So 1918 was an eye-opening experience.
Mm-hmm. Philadelphia baseball suffered some prominent influenza casualties in 1918 too, including Chandler Richter, the son of the founder and the editor of the Sporting News, which was, for our young listeners, an influential Philadelphia-based weekly. Tom Mack, the brother of the A's manager, Connie Mack. What other prominent casualties did baseball suffer across the country?
Well, I just know in Boston, it wasn't the players, but a couple, including a guy by the name of Martin, really good sports writers from Boston. Martin and his wife died. And, there's some speculation that they might have gotten the flu during the game. During the series, I don't know because they died a little bit later. But there weren't any really in Boston super prominent players that died of the flu.
Randy, here's the $1 million question: how does the current COVID-19 pandemic compare to the Spanish flu?
Well, of course, we've advanced significantly in in medicine. We certainly understand flus much better. We understand how to mitigate damage done by flus. This flu, so far, is not showing the same morbidity that 1918 did. I'm an optimist, but we're living in very strange times. I mean, my brother said, I was talking to him today, and he said, this is. I've never lived through it. We're not young, but he said, I've never lived through a time like this. I mean, what's going on today, to watch TV, to see the stock market going down 3,000 points, to hear, shutting down restaurants, shutting down bars, cities deserted, looking like ghost towns. It's a strange world we live in. That's for sure.
What can we learn to help us move forward with the current pandemic from 1918? I mean, it seems like, the no-brainer is that you limit large public gatherings, but, what else? I mean, what lessons can we take from 1918 that that we can use today?
Well, I think you can't manage the truth. Okay,
Right.
you can't fix the truth. You can't shave something off of the truth. You have to tell. We have leaders at the state level, at the national level, at the local level, and we need truth. Americans need to know, what should we do? What's the problem? Maybe what's the worst? You can't try to say, everything's going to be okay. It will play itself out. It might. You don't know. But the first thing you need is truth, and you can't manage it. It just has to be blunt and cold.
Well, what's been so disappointing to me is you listen to the hearings on Capitol Hill, and regardless of what your politics are, both the Democrats and the Republicans are playing the blame game. And look, it's here. Stop the carping and do something about it. And if you can't do something about it, get the hell out of the way and let the medical community handle it. And I think, you're absolutely right. I mean, we were not told the truth. And we got to get away from this rigid partisanship and, a little less e pluribus and a lot more unum in this country. I mean, that's what we need.
If a person goes to, if they come down with cancer, God, I hope they don't, but as they do, a doctor's going to tell them the facts. Here's survival rates, here's percentages. The facts are cold and they're harsh and they can be brutal, but once you know the facts, once you know the truth, well, then you can begin to deal with it, and you can begin to have regulations. Whether it's isolation, whether it's what we're going through, hunkering down in the house. Okay, you understand. We need to do it for this reason. But if nobody caused what we're going through, I don't think. Certainly, but there are people making mistakes in trying to manage the truth, and that's a mistake.
Mm-hmm. We're hearing forecasts of this thing spiking in May, possibly June. Any speculation about what's going to happen in the baseball season if that occurs? I mean, we know now that colleges, Division I colleges, have suspended their baseball seasons. They sent their players home. A couple of Division I kids have just, that I coached in high school, they're back home now. Going to get together with them and catch some bullpens for them. What do you think is going to happen if this continues into June?
Well, the one thing that I know is that looking at the entire season, as I said before, the baseball season was in doubt. And the owners of the teams, the lords of baseball, the commissioners, really were playing two games in 1918. Number one, they were trying to make baseball games displays of patriotism. They had soldiers, with bats, dressed in their uniforms with bats, filling in for rifles, marching in close order and trained to do marches. And before they played national anthem became a regular at baseball games in that year. They all kinds of patriotic appeals for people to enlist, and it becomes a really kind of seedbed of patriotism. Behind the scenes, the managers and owners are lobbying the draft board, saying, give us some exemptions. Don't draft our players. Give us 9 exemptions or 18 exemptions. 18 seems way too much, and people recoiled from that. But allow us to keep our players. Allow us to keep the game going. Don't stop the game. Because, they had payrolls to make. They had to rent on their stadiums. And so they were playing a money game and a patriotism game. I don't think owners have changed dramatically. They have a bottom line. They owe money. So if they can keep the game going in any way, they will. I don't think they're going to buck public sentiment, but as soon as there's a sign that maybe this thing's abating, I'm not saying they're going to play the next day, but they're going to try to salvage something, whether it's a shortened season, whether it's, play 50 games and then a series. I don't know, but I'm sure that they will try to salvage something. But who knows? I mean, I'm a historian. I look in the past. I don't look in the future that well.
Well, I think that's a very insightful speculation. I'll tell you what your remarks remind me of, though. When LeBron James said, "Look, what." He was asked, "What happens? We close the venue to fans, and you just play the game." And LeBron said, "I'm not going to play. I play for the fans."
I think he walked that back.
I'm sorry?
I think he walked that back, though, didn't he?
Yeah, I think he did a little bit, but how refreshing it was if that was his knee-jerk reaction to it. How refreshing would that be to your baseball players say that? You know, I mean, with obviously the money that's out there, no one's going to take the hit if they don't have to. But for a professional athlete to say that, and if that's his knee-jerk reaction, I'm pretty proud of that. I mean, I'd like to know how many other players would say that in any sport.
I think probably a lot of players agreed with him. But a couple days after that, LeBron, I don't know who talked to him, maybe nobody, but he walked it back. He said, "Well, no, I'll do whatever everybody else does. I'll play, but it won't be the same." And it wouldn't be the same. And my guess is baseball. If baseball goes on this year, it will be with fans. Okay, if the fans can't come to the games, that means we still have a very severe problem, and I don't think the owners will play under those conditions. The owners were very quick to, well, they didn't cancel the season, but to delay the opening games, and now they're indefinitely delayed. They haven't canceled the season yet, but the NCAA, the basketball, they were quick. The NCAA moves at a glacial pace. I mean, that is a slow-moving organization, but yet they immediately canceled tournaments, and then the NCAA tournament first the league tournaments. And so my guess is when sports resume as normal, we're going to be in the fans. Fans are going to be watching the games.
I hope you're right. You're right. We've been speaking with Randy Roberts, author of the forthcoming War Fever, Boston Baseball and America in the Shadow of the Great War, to be published by Basic Books later this year.
Basic Books.
You can order the book online at Amazon Books. Thanks for being with us, Randy, and good luck with the book.
I appreciate it. Thank you very much.
And thank you, Philly fans, for tuning in. See you next week for another podcast of Philadelphia Baseball, Past, Present, and Personal. This is Bill Kashatus, rounding third and heading home on the Comfortably Zoned Radio Network.
The proceeding has been a Comfortably Zoned Network production. You are advised to keep your dreams wet, your humor dry, your children and grandchildren out of military recruiting offices and off the laps of clerics who wear dresses. Thank you for listening, everyone. Happy trails.